Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lesson. Today's class is going to be on the topic of race and inequality, connecting it to all the other forms of inequality that we've been looking at. So let me say a few things before getting into today's lesson. So the first thing is, I would say that, in America, race is generally kind of an uncomfortable topic, right? It's a topic that people feel a little bit, sometimes feel a little bit kind of uncomfortable hearing about, kind of uncomfortable talking about. A lot of this has to do with America's experience with race, in history, with slavery, with the experience of segregation in the middle of the 20th century, and then even the contemporary experience of race in the last 3 or 4 years, right? This year alone, we've seen, shootings of people of color by police. We've seen protests, about those shootings, and so America has problems with race. It has problems with its race relations, and so it makes it, in some sense, difficult sometimes to talk about. And what I would say is, social science and sociology can give us a way to talk about it, right? Can give us a different way to think about and talk about this, important yet uncomfortable topic of race. Right? So even though race is uncomfortable, race is something we cannot avoid, right? We need to talk about it. It's something as a country, as a nation, we need to think about and talk about and to some extent, keep dealing with, right? Race might never be something that we solve, but it is something that we need to keep working at. So that's the first thing, right? So that's kind of just a general preamble. The second thing is just to kind of understand where we're going to be doing this week is, so in today's lesson, I'm going to be generally talking about, the fundamentals of race and inequality, talking about different aspects of that, economic inequality, health inequalities, just kind of general kind of fundamentals, some fundamental inequalities. And then on Thursday, I'm going to be talking more about the contemporary experience of race, what's been happening more in, say, the last 2 to 3 years, right? And so kind of give us a way to kind of talk about contemporary issues. And then the third thing I would say is, for today's lesson, I'm going to be presenting a lot of like graphs and numbers. You'll be seeing a lot of, figures, right? And so I guess what my general point is, or one point is that I would say is, you're all adults now, right? You're all college students. And what that means is that you can all make up your own minds, right? It's up to you to form your own opinions, right? And it's not my job to tell you what to think or to tell you what your opinions about the world should be, right? However, I think it is, important that your opinions be informed, no matter what they are, no matter what you believe. Your beliefs should be based on some, solid information, some solid facts, and kind of some, information about the world. And in some sense, that's what I can provide. And so in today's lesson, we're going to be seeing a lot of facts, right? Going to be seeing a lot of the data around race and inequality. And so what I would say is, everybody is has a right to their own opinion, but the facts are in some sense something that we have to agree on and are based in, reality. And so people have their own opinions, but the facts are kind of in general, right? And today I'm going to be trying to stick close to the facts and you kind of just give you really the data around race and inequality. And I think, people can still argue about that, but a lot of it is indisputable. Okay, so let's jump in. Okay. So race and inequality. So in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about, maybe 3 different ways that we can think about race and inequality. So first is kind of economic racial inequality. So inequality in terms of wealth and income. Then we can talk about the persistence of segregation in, the 21st century. Right? So that segregation is not just something that we can think of as happening in the past. And then lastly, talking about racial health disparities, right? This is a topic that, I'm particularly interested in as someone who researches health, right? So let's jump in and talk about economics. Okay, so what we can say is that, we can imagine that historically there has been a gap in the economic positions of people in different races, right? And this is what we know about, America in the 20th century, 19th century, historically, different racial groups have fared economically. And there might be some idea that, in the 21st century, that we have, overcome, or, things are more, equal, in the 21st century. But unfortunately, what we can find is that that's not actually true. That what we find is that there's the persistence of economic racial inequality. And we can kind of see this in a few different ways. So the first way we can see this is we can simply look at the racial income gap, right? So this is, if we remember, the difference between income and race. Income is an amount of money or resources that you're getting in on a regular basis, your monthly or annual income, whereas wealth is all your savings that you have accumulated, everything that you have in terms of, that you have saved up, including, material goods like a car or a house or something like that. And so what we see in this graph here, leading up to the 2008 economic recession is that Black Americans earn about 40% less than white Americans on average. Right? So if we look at the income of different racial groups, we see that Black Americans earn considerably less than white Americans. And that's also true for Hispanic Americans. Right? That Hispanic Americans also earn considerably less than average white Americans. And so if we look at this in terms of, accumulated earnings, so if we think to ourselves, okay, and this data is now more recent after the economic recession of 2008, if we think about this in terms of how much, this will matter over, a person's lifetime, we see that, there's a considerable gap, right? That, over somebody's lifetime, it means that their lifetime earnings will be distinctly different, right, that we see in this graph. And again, that average white Americans are earning more lifetime earnings than average Black Americans and average Hispanic Americans. And so this difference in income and difference in lifetime earnings then produces a difference in wealth, right? So if you're earning less income, right, if you have less money, then essentially you have less money to save. Right? Less income means less wealth to accumulate. And so it's in the racial wealth gap that we see a bigger or a high degree of inequality between the racial groups. Right? And so what we see here is that in terms of wealth, we see that on average, the average white American earns about or has about 12 times the amount of wealth as the average Black American, and about 10 times the amount of wealth as the average Hispanic American, right? And so we see, there's a considerable gap in wealth, right? That white Americans, like myself, are earning or having a greater degree of wealth than other racial groups. And what's interesting is that this is also true when we look at college graduates, right? So we might think, okay, maybe some of the racial wealth gap is, people having different types of jobs. Maybe white Americans are having, jobs that require a college degree and thus be able to accumulate more wealth than people of other racial groups. But what's surprising to some degree is that even when we look at the group of people with a college degree, the racial wealth gap still exists, right? And still exists relatively to the same degree, right? That we still see, maybe a little bit less, but to a similar degree, we still see, a considerable racial wealth gap. That white Americans with a college degree have considerable more wealth than Latinx Americans with a college degree and Black Americans with a college degree. And so even with a college degree, that wealth gap still remains, still holds true. What we can ask ourselves, what has happened to the racial wealth gap, over time? Are things getting better? Have they stayed the same? Are they getting worse? And so to a large degree, to a certain extent, what we can say is that they have gotten worse, right? Meaning that there is more racial inequality now than there was in the early 2000s. And so part of this is what happened in what's called the Great Recession. So in 2008, 2009, there was a huge economic recession, right? The biggest economic recession since the Great Depression. And so everybody during that time lost wealth and lost income. But then what we see is that some groups got hit harder than others, and some groups were able to recover better than others. And so what we see is that during the Great Recession, the racial wealth disparities got greater, right? So Asian, Hispanic, and Black Americans saw their wealth fall by about 60%, whereas white Americans actually only saw their wealth fall about by 23%, right? And so, as you can see in this. Okay, hopefully we're still with me. I think my internet cut out. Okay, let's start again. Okay, so as you can see in this graph here, before the Great Recession of 2008, there was a racial wealth gap of about 10, right? So meaning that the average white American family had about 10 times the amount of wealth as the average Black American family. But then after the recession, that increased to about 12 times, and then 12.9, and then it's gone down slightly, right? Part of the reason for this is that the Great Recession really saw a fall in housing prices and how the value of people's houses, and so people of color, Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, had more of their wealth wrapped up in their housing, and so when the housing fell, they got hurt worse. Right? And so we see, really the racial wealth gap has not gone away, right? That racial inequalities are not something that have disappeared, right? So this is a different way to look at wealth. But basically, so they're using a little bit different numbers, but basically this is telling you the same thing, right? That that the racial wealth gap has actually increased for Black Americans, but actually for Hispanic Americans, it's actually stayed somewhat more stable using these numbers. This is more recent data, and so this is why the numbers are a bit different, right? But the overall story is the same, right? That racial inequality, racial economic inequality is not something of the past. It persists, and if anything, it actually is getting a bit worse. And so we have not solved that, right? That's not something that has gone away. There is still serious issues in terms of racial economic inequality. Okay, but we have to remember that inequality or economic inequality is only one aspect of race, right? It's not just race relations in America. That's not just all of it, and so we can talk about different forms of racial relations and different forms of inequality. So the next The next thing we can talk about then is the persistence of segregation. And so here I'm kind of continuing to kind of follow the same theme. I'm continuing to follow the same theme. And that theme is that, you know, things that we might have thought have been just something of the past, or, you know, that something that we have gotten over actually persists. You know, actually is not something that we have finished dealing with. And so one of those issues is segregation. And so we might have thought, you know, segregation is something that was quote unquote solved, you know, in the 1950s, 1960s with the civil rights movement. But what we find actually is segregation in America is something that still persists. So to understand this, we have to talk about two different forms of segregation. That is de jure segregation and then de facto segregation, right? So de jure segregation is segregation, right? So when the segregation by the law, and meaning that the law requires racial groups to be separate, right? To go to live in separate neighborhoods, to attend different separate schools, to use separate facilities, right? And this is what we generally think of, or, you know, understand as what was, you know, being fought about in the civil rights era, right? So you have, you know, during the civil rights, during 1950s, 1960s, you have people being forced to use different waiting rooms, being forced to use different hotels, right? That the racial groups were kept separate, right? And this was required by the law, you know, particularly in southern states, right? And so what we see is, you know, this is, you know, that this was what was fought over in the 1950s and 1960s in America, right? So you have 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court case that required that, you know, schools be desegregated, that you couldn't legally require, you know, states could not legally have separate schools for white Americans and Americans of other racial groups, right? And then a big court case, a big fight over this was the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, when 9 African American students were, you know, enrolled in a you know, white segregated school. The governor of Arkansas brought out the National Guard to stop them, but then the President Eisenhower brought out a separate, you know, kind of force to allow them to enter the school and to, you know, make the law go through. And so in a way, we have to remember that, you know, this is relatively recent history, right? This is only 50, 60 years ago that in America we had certain states requiring racial groups to be separate, you know, to attend different schools, to attend different colleges, you know, that there was, you know, a law that made and forced the racial groups to be separate. And this obviously produced, you know, inequality. However, what we have is we still have what's called de facto segregation, right? So de jure segregation is in the past, but we still have what's called de facto segregation. This is segregation that exists even when there are not laws specifically banning it, right? You know, even when there's not a law requiring the racial groups to be separate, the racial groups still tend to separate, right? You know, so for example, we still see, particularly in the South, you know, segregation of fraternities and sororities, right? That, you know, you still have sororities and fraternities that are predominantly white, and then, you know, other fraternities and sororities that are for people of color. And, you know, there's not a law that requires this, but it just kind of happens. One of the best examples of how segregation still exists in America is residential segregation, right? Meaning that racial groups tend to still continue to live in separate neighborhoods. And so one way we can see this is by looking at census data, right? So the last census was done that we have data for was done in 2010. You know, we did another census this year in 2020, but 2010 is the last census that we have data from in terms of race. And so we can actually map out the degree of segregation that people have, right? And so we can know, certain facts about residential segregation, right? That the average white American lives in a neighborhood that's 80% white, so predominantly white. Average Black American lives in a neighborhood that's majority Black, right? So 55% Black. And the average Hispanic American lives in a neighborhood that is also mostly made up of other Hispanics, 45% Hispanic. And so one of the best ways to see this residential segregation is actually to look at maps. And I find these maps really interesting because they give you a graphic representation of, of our current racial experience. So the way to understand the maps is, this is census data, and the blue dots are Black residents, the red dots are white residents, the orange dots are Hispanic residents, and the green dots are Asian residents. And so we can first look at a southern state, a southern city, like St. Louis, right? And what we see here is, we see you can clearly see the segregation happening, right? We see, Black neighborhoods, clear Black neighborhoods, and clear white neighborhoods, right? And you can kind of see how people are separating out. And so, this being a southern city, we can understand that some of this is just history, right? That this is the result of de jure segregation. This is a result of people living, in different neighborhoods, being forced to live in different neighborhoods, and then just that progressing over time. However, what's interesting is that this is not just, an issue with the South, right? Now, often when we think of segregation, we think, oh, well, that's a problem, or that's a situation that occurs just in the southern part of the United States. But that's actually not true. And so we can look at a northern city like Chicago, and we can see clear residential segregation happening, right? So we see the south side of Chicago there, a predominantly Black neighborhood. We see the north side, a predominantly, of white neighborhoods. We see suburbs that are predominantly white, right? And then we see other neighborhoods made up of racial groups, right? Orange dots of, Hispanic Americans, right? So we see clear Hispanic neighborhoods. And so what we really see is, racial groups still segregating. And so we can think of like a city like Chicago as being very cosmopolitan, being very like, oh, you can get every different type of food, and there's people with many different nationalities and ethnicities. But what we also see is, while that is true, what we also see is that people are still, choosing to live in different neighborhoods to a certain degree, right? What's interesting to bring this home in terms of, our own class is we see this in terms of New York City, right? So again, we think of New York City as very cosmopolitan, as very multicultural, right? A place where there's many different ethnic groups, many different nationalities, many different languages spoken, many different, places to eat, right? But what we also see is the dominance of residential segregation, right? So here in this map of New York City, we can see clear white neighborhoods, such as in Manhattan and Staten Island. We can see clear Black neighborhoods, such as in parts of Brooklyn. And then we can also see, Hispanic neighborhoods and even Asian neighborhoods. And so even a cosmopolitan 21st century city like New York City, we see that there is the persistence of segregation. And so, again, segregation is not just something that we see as in the past, but it's something that persists to this day. Okay, the last topic for today that I want to talk about is actually racial health disparities. So as a person who studies health inequalities, this is something that I'm particularly interested in. One kind of word of warning before getting into these facts. First, when we're thinking about racial health disparities, we have to be clear that we're not talking about genetic differences, right? So we have to remember that race is a social construction. And so what that means is that there's not some physiological or genetic difference between the racial groups, because race is really a social classification, not a biological or physiological classification, right? It's to some degree a fiction, right? It's only a social reality. And so we're not talking about the physiological differences between racial groups, but rather we're talking about how people of different racial groups are treated by society and how that produces different health outcomes. Okay, so we can see this in a couple of different ways. First way we can see it is rates of disease by race. So we can look at a couple common chronic diseases, right? So first we can look at diabetes, right? And so what we find is, right, that there are different rates of diabetes by race, right? So white Americans have the lowest rate of diabetes, then followed by Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, and then Native Americans. And so what we see is that, nearly Hispanic, Black, and Native Americans have nearly double the risk of diabetes than white Americans, right? So that it's not just differences in economics that's occurring, but it's differences in people's bodies, differences in people's health, right? So when we think about inequality, we shouldn't just think about money, we should also think about people's experiences being alive. So we see this in terms of diabetes. We see this in terms of asthma, right? So this is children with asthma. And so again, the more stark difference here is actually between Black Americans and then other racial groups, right? So we see that white Americans, Hispanic Americans, and then also Asian Americans have a relatively similar rates of asthma in children, except that Asian Americans, a little bit lower. But then what we see is that Black Americans have nearly double the rate of asthma, right? That of in children, right? So first off, what we see is we see that racial groups are experiencing different rates of disease, right? And so asthma and diabetes are two good examples of this. And there's other differences that we could have also looked at, like heart disease and cancer, and we see similar trends in the graphs that I just showed you. So then the question then becomes, well, what happens with these different experiences of disease? Does this produce a kind of an outcome? It does, right? It produces an outcome in terms of life expectancy. And so we can look at life expectancy in terms of race, right? So here's what we see. Here's a kind of a general graph of life expectancy in America. And so what we see is that, all Americans have a relatively speaking long life in terms of, around the world, but that different racial groups within America have different degrees of life expectancy, right? So we see that on average, the life expectancy for all Americans is about 78 years, but for Hispanic Americans, actually their life expectancy is higher by about 3 years. For white Americans, it's right around the average. And then for Black Americans, it's about 3 years shorter, right? And then we see, again, we can see higher discrepancies when we look at gender, right? So we see, among males, there's a larger gap for Black American males, right? That now there's a gap of about 5 years, right? And so what we see is in this graph is that your racial identity is not just affecting how much income or wealth you might be able to have, but also how many years alive you are going to live. And so we can see that we can track this again over time. And so what we see is that a couple of things in this graph, right? So we can see first off that, again, the basic story is that we see that white Americans are living longer than Black Americans, right? So if we're particularly now looking at the gap in life expectancy between Black and white Americans, right, we can see that there is a gap there, right? That that white Americans, both female white and male white, are living longer than their counterparts. And so we see also that this gap has persisted for a long time, right? Since the 1970s onwards, there has been this gap, right? What we can also notice is that to a certain degree, the gap is shrinking, slightly, right? The gap is a little bit smaller in 2009 than what it was in 1970. Right, so that's positive news. However, the way to think about this is that Black Americans are in some sense lagging behind in terms of their life expectancy, right? That in 2009, Black American men had the life expectancy that white American men had in 1970. The same is true for women, right? That in 2009, Black American women had the life expectancy that white American women had in 1970, right? And so there's this kind of like 40-year lag that's happening, right? That Black Americans are trying to catch up in terms of life expectancy, and they are being able to shrink the gap to some extent, but they are still behind, right? Another way we can think about this is terms of what's called the infant mortality rate. So the infant mortality rate is the number of infants that die per 1,000 infants, right? So it's deaths before the age of 1, right? And so we can say, okay, we have 1,000 infants, right? 1,000 American infants. How many of those infants will die, before the age of 1 per 1,000? And so what we see is that the overall infant mortality rate in America is 6.7. And it's relatively low in terms of the world averages. A little bit higher than other countries, like in the industrialized world, like Canada and Britain, but much lower than average of the world, right? So 6.7. So that means of 1,000 infants, 6.7 will die before the age of 1. And so we see that the rate for non-Hispanic whites is pretty similar to that average, a bit lower at 5.8, right? So, still pretty low. But then what we see is that the big discrepancy is when we look at, Black American infants, right? And so what we see here is that the infant mortality rate for African Americans is at 13.4, right? To put this in another pretty blunt way, in America in the 21st century, Black American babies have twice the chance of dying before the age of 1 than white American babies, right? And that's a pretty considerable difference, in terms of risk of death, right? So it's not just how long you're going to live, but it's also whether or not you get to live, right? Whether or not you get to exist, in the world. And what we see is that, for Black Americans, there's a much higher chance that they will die, before they will get to be alive in the world. And so we see this graph over time, and one couple things to note here is that we can see that it has shrunk over time, the infant mortality rate for Black Americans, right? And so it has gone down from 2000 to 2010, so that's good news. It's been a fairly considerable drop, and even then in recent years, from after 2010, there has been a more of a drop. And so the infant mortality rate for Black Americans is going lower. Again, what we can notice is that we can look a bit at Hispanic Americans, and we can see that their infant mortality rate is actually similar to white Americans and the average. And this idea, what I want to talk about briefly now, is what's called the Hispanic mortality paradox. And what it is why it's a paradox is something that is not unexplained. Like researchers are unsure why it happens, right? But what we see is, we can see this clearly by looking at life expectancy, that Hispanic Americans have the longest life expectancy in America, and higher than the average, and higher than white Americans. So that Hispanic Americans actually live the longest of any racial group in America, right? And part of the reason why this is called a paradox is, by their economic situation, Hispanic Americans are lower in terms of their economic situation, but then have a longer life, and so it's unclear why why that happens. But it's important to note, there are reasons for this, but too much for today's lesson. Okay, so we have these racial health disparities. And in particular, what we see a gap in the health outcomes of Black Americans and other racial groups, right? And both in terms of their life expectancy, infant mortality rate, and rates of disease. And so we want to try to understand, well, what's happening here? Why is it that Black Americans have a lower life expectancy than other racial groups? And so there's a few different reasons for this. So one is economic racial inequality, right? So all the things I was just talking about previously, right? That we know that Black Americans have less income and less wealth. And so this connects back to, a previous lesson where we talked about the relationship between economics and health. So I'm going to show you this graph again, right? So we know that people with less income and less wealth, right? People at the lower end of the economic spectrum, live shorter lives, right? So somebody who earns less than $20,000 a year is going to have about 6 years shorter life than somebody who earns over $80,000 a year, right? And so what happens then is we can say, same with diabetes, right? And so then if we know that if Black Americans have less wealth and less income, then they are more likely to be affected by the economic consequences of health, right? Being lower on the economic spectrum, then they are going to be, that's going to affect their life expectancy. However, so that's the first thing, right? Economics is playing a role because Black Americans are lower on the economic spectrum or lower on the economic ladder on average. Then that's affecting not just their income and wealth, but also affecting their health and life expectancy. However, it's not just all about economics, meaning economics is not the full explanation. So we can look at this graph here, and I'm going to kind of explain it a little bit. And these are in 1980s dollars, so the money is a little bit different, but the relationship continues to hold true, even in current 21st century economic situation. So, okay, we see two things here. So we see first off that, right, the more money you earn, the longer you can expect to live, right? Is life expectancy at age 25, right? So more money means longer life, and we know that, right? But what we also see here is that we see that even among Black Americans and white Americans who earn the same money, have the same degree of income, white Americans still live longer, right? So white Americans live about 2 to 2.5 years longer, even when they have the same amount of income or wealth as the other racial group, right? And so that is saying it's not just all about money. There's a bigger story than this money happening. We can see this again in terms of education, right? And this data is a little bit more recent, right? 1990s. And so what we see here is that, we first see that, people with more education, they live longer, right? And we know this. Why do they live longer? Because with more education, you're able to get a better job, more income, your economic situation you're going to be better off. However, what's also true that we see is that among white Americans and Black Americans with the same level of education, white Americans are still living longer, right? So even if you have a college degree, what we see is that white Americans are still going to live about 4 years longer than a Black American with also having a college degree. And so, we see, there is this, difference here. One amazing kind of statistic is, again, the infant mortality rate, right? So the infant mortality rate of white mothers with less than a high school degree is about or roughly the same as the infant mortality rate of Black mothers with a college degree, right? So this is saying that, again, it's not all about class. It's not all about how much income or wealth you earn or how much education you have, right? Because white mothers without a high school degree have the same infant mortality rate of Black mothers with a college degree, right? And so, if it was all about education or income, then you should not see this result happening here, right? And again, we see, the Hispanic mortality paradox is also a way to understand this, right? That if it was all about economics, we know that Hispanic Americans have an economic situation similar to Black Americans, but they tend to live longer, and so there has to be something going on that's not just economics here. So what's happening? What is the answer? What is the result? What's going on? So we can kind of sum this up in the concept of embodied racism. So what this concept basically is saying is that the discrimination and racism that Black Americans face is directly affecting their health and bodies. Right? That's not just about their economic situation, not explained through the class, but the direct experience of discrimination, right? Daily experience of experiences racism and discrimination is not just affecting, the happiness or the psychology of Black Americans, but affecting their bodies, right? Affecting their health, right? And so this is the idea of embodied racism that affects the body, right? So it's embodied, going into people's body. And so what do we mean? What do we mean by embodied racism in particular? So we mean a few things, right? We mean the persistence of residential segregation. So as I was showing before, the racial groups live in different neighborhoods, right? And so what we find is that Black Americans tend to live in worse neighborhoods, right? So regardless of their personal wealth or income, Black Americans are more likely to live in a worse neighborhood than white Americans, right? So this means neighborhoods without gyms, sidewalks, neighborhoods that are more likely to be dangerous, neighborhoods that don't have playgrounds for children to play in, right? And so because residential segregation is making people live in different neighborhoods, and that's producing a result on the health and bodies of people of different racial groups. One clear way to see this is pollution, right? The racial minorities in America live in neighborhoods with 38% more pollution, right? So by just being a racial minority in America, you're more likely to live in a neighborhood or in a place that has more air pollution. But it's other basic things too. It's living in what's called a food desert, right? Living in a neighborhood that does not have a grocery store, right? And so what we see is that Black Americans are much more likely to live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a grocery store than white Americans. And so when you don't live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a grocery store, it's much harder to shop. It's much harder to buy healthy, nutritious food, right? So again, it's affecting, not just it's a shame not to have a grocery store. No, it's affecting your health. It's food is something that's essential to keep people's bodies in good shape. What else? It's stress, right? So we know that stress is harmful to the body, right? In particular, chronic stress. So stress is your body's reaction to a threat, right? Your body is reacting to a threat. It's increasing your heart rate. It's giving you a shot of adrenaline. It's increasing your blood pressure. It's making you more alert, right? It's putting you into fight or flight mode, right? And so that's a stress response. Your body kind of reacting, and because you're stressed, but it's your body's reaction to a perceived threat to kind of help you out. You're like, oh, okay, maybe there's something here that we need to respond to. The problem is when these stressors happen chronically, or all the time. And so if a person is feeling continually stressed, then that's actually over time has a negative effect on their body, right? They are feeling, their blood pressure becomes continually high, their body gets worn down more. Chronic stress is bad for your health, just really bad. And so what we find then is that Black Americans are experiencing more stress than white Americans, right? So about 4 times the degree of stress, right? A considerable portion of Black Americans experience daily stress or chronic stress, right? And so the argument is, well, what are they experiencing stress over, right, Black Americans? And the argument that has been made is Black Americans are experiencing stress from discrimination, right? Stress that is, from the day-to-day experience of feeling discriminated against. That can be anything from, being followed around the store, from feeling threatened with interactions with police officers, from being worried about your children, going out in the streets. It is an experience of stress that comes directly from your racial identity, right? So not from your economics, but just from being identified as being a Black American, right? Being Black in America. It is producing stress, and this stress can be frequent, right? It can, whenever you go out in the streets, you can feel, that you might experience discrimination. It's ambiguous, right? You don't know whether or not somebody is being racist to you. Like, are they giving you a bad look, or is that person really following you around the store, or is it just, your imagination? You don't know, but that's stressful. It's uncontrollable, or you can't stop somebody from being discriminatory or racist against you. And it's unpredictable, meaning you don't know when it's going to happen. And so these tend to be all the characteristics of stress that's really bad for you, and it tends to be the kind of stress that is produced by racism. Okay. And in particular, we can understand this statistic that I showed you before, right? The infant mortality rate, right? We can ask ourselves, well, what, really, why is this happening? Why do Black Americans have such a high rate of infant mortality? And so to understand this, we have to understand the relationship between stress and pregnancy. So what we find is that among Black Americans, they're much more likely to be born preterm or prematurely, right? So not to go the full 9 months of gestation, right? So Black Americans are much more likely than other racial groups to be born prematurely, right? And being born prematurely is really problematic for your health and your ability, to live. It can reduces your body weight when being born. Organs cannot be fully formed. It can produce a host of health problems for new infants, then resulting in their death or their higher risk of dying, right? That being born preterm is, a direct causal link to infant mortality. And so then we have to ask, well, why are Black American women, mothers, why are they delivering babies more preterm than other racial groups? It tends to be a result of stress, right? So when you're pregnant, your body is very attuned to, what's happening, in terms of your stress level, right? And then if you have experiences of stress, then you're much more likely, much more likely to give birth. That your stresses, your body gets these signals that say, okay, we're ready to give birth now. And these are very closely aligned to stress signals, right? And so as Black American women experience more daily stress, they are much more likely then to have a pregnancy that goes prematurely, thus putting their children more at risk. And so we can see the direct link between the experience of stress from racism to the infant mortality rate among Black Americans. But we also see it in terms of disparities in medical care, right? And so we see that in numerous different research, Black Americans and people of color in America do not receive the same quality of care as white Americans, right? So from the 2012 National Healthcare Disparities Report, so a national report about racial health disparities in medical care in America, we see that Hispanic Americans and Black Americans receive about 40% less quality measures than white Americans. So these are things like waiting time, correct dosage in terms of medicine, how long your doctor saw. There's a kind of a list of these quality measures, and Black Americans are receiving them about 40% less. Native Americans are receiving about 33% less on these quality measures, right? And so that people of color in America are receiving a lower level of medical care, and then this is resulting in worse health outcomes. We see it in terms of, not just in general medical care, but, in specialized medicine, right? So for example, neurology, right? So Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are considerably less likely to be referred to a neurologist, right? So if you have a brain problem with your brain, a cognitive problem or some other, neurological problem, if you're a white American, you're much more likely to get seen by a neurologist than if you're a Black American or Hispanic American. Right? Black Americans are receiving less pain medications, right? So we see this in result in pain medications. Why? They did research asking medical students about their beliefs about the biological differences between Black and white Americans, and what they found was that medical students had held many stereotypical beliefs. And this is kind of surprising because these are people who are learning about medicine. These are people who are learning about the bodies of humans. But even here, even on these trained professionals, we see that these racial stereotypes that are in the back of people's brains are affecting their medical beliefs, right? And so that medical students tended to believe things like this. These are all not true. But they tended to believe that Black Americans didn't need pain medication as much as white Americans. And so therefore, resulting in less pain medication being given to Black Americans. Again, some of it is residential segregation, right? So Black Americans were, in one study, were likely to live next to a high quality hospital, but then were seen at a low quality hospital. Why? Because of America's history of segregation. It used to be that there was, hospitals for white Americans and hospitals for Black Americans, and that has, that even it's not by law now, that, where you go to hospital has kind of maintained itself. And so that's making Black Americans go to lower quality hospitals. And so for all these reasons, what we see is that Black Americans and other racial minorities in America are receiving a lower quality of medical care. And so for all these reasons and many others, it's resulting in a racial health gap, right? A gap in which Black Americans in particular are having more health problems and a lower life expectancy. So that's the lesson for today. On Thursday, I'm going to give another lesson and talk more about contemporary issues of race.